So hi everybody, my name is Matthew Demsky. I'm with Google on behalf of Google's GWT team, and I'm here to talk to you about the GWT open source project. So just a little bit of background on me. I joined the GWT team back in last year, and I've been focusing largely on the open source, on our interaction with the open source community, but also doing a lot of kind of internal cleanup efforts as well. So in Ray's keynote, he talked a lot about kind of the technical details and the technical history of the GWT SDK. And this talk's going to be more about kind of the open source project itself and a little bit of background on why it is, how it is, where it is today, and kind of where we want it to go in the future. So just a little bit of background on the project. GWT started back in 2006 as the Google Web Toolkit. Google announced it at Java 1 in May 2006 and basically began using it internally within Google around the same time. And later that year, December 2006, we open sourced GWT as GWT 1.3. You can find some more details on GWT blog posts or on Wikipedia. So quick aside about software engineering at Google, because since GWT came from Google, it helps to have an idea of how Google develops software so you can have the right mindset about where we came from. Google's done a lot of presentations on this. If you want to, you can find them, for example, at EclipseCon 2013. There's a talk, Continuous Integration at Google Scale. Goes into a lot of details. But at least for this talk, kind of the high-level summary is Google uses one huge source control repository for all source code, or for almost every project at Google. We have more than 10,000 engineers working out of it. Everybody works out of a single branch for the most part. We have continuous integration, and so that means you make one change and all downstream users see that change immediately. And that's really cool and really powerful, but it's also has a big impact on how you do development. That if you have to really worry about breaking downstream users with any change you make, because if you break something, it can immediately put 10,000 engineers offline until you fix it. So we have kind of a big effort on pre-submit checks. And so specifically, GWT software engineering at Google, starting back in June 2010, we started maintaining GWT out of Google's internal source repository. And there are kind of pros and cons to this. One of the pros is it made it a lot easier for us to, well, our internal build files kind of have to mirror what's in the open source build files. And it also means our internal integration for downstream users is fairly complicated. And I'm sure external users of GWT are kind of familiar with a lot of the quirks of GWT, like configuring GWT module files and dealing with linkers or various kind of GWT nuances. And internally, we try to be kind of magical about that, and people end up depending on undefined behavior without realizing it. And it ends up becoming kind of our responsibility to deal with those things. And also, GWT's just a really large project, so our team ends up being responsible for all this stuff. So, like I said, we were developing GWT out of Google's internal code repository for a while, and it did make it a lot easier for Googlers to contribute, who are our kind of main contributors for a while. And we were able to benefit from our internal build and testing infrastructure. We get really quick feedback from our users when things break. We didn't have to go through a release cycle of making a bunch of changes and then realizing we are breaking assumptions that users have. So we were able to get a lot of confidence from immediate continuous integration tests across all of Google. But it did make it a lot harder for us to accept external contributions. It also meant that we couldn't accept patches if they would break Google users. And so this kind of really did slow down how quickly we could accept external changes. So in mid-2012, Google went through some internal kind of group reorganizations, and the GWT project was a little more affected by this than most other teams. And the end result was there's almost an entirely new team of engineers working on GWT. There's a couple still working on it, but other engineers have moved on to other projects. So now we've got a new team, new management, and it gave us a chance to kind of reevaluate where we want to go with the project, look at where we are, where we want to be, what's working, what's not. And one of the things we decided was we really wanted to re-emphasize engaging with the open source community, making it easier for external people to contribute, and kind of have a more level playing ground between Google and external members. We didn't want GWT to be tied to Google. And that's not to say Google's abandoning GWT or anything. Google's still heavily invested in GWT and going to be heavily involved. But we want external people to feel like they have a say in where GWT goes. So we went through this little process we called Quitification internally. So for example, GWT now, just GWT, isn't an acronym anymore. It's just the name. It doesn't stand for Google Web Toolkit now, which makes it, I guess, legally a little bit easier for external people to kind of talk on behalf of GWT. It doesn't get misrepresented as talking on behalf of Google. And we also formed the GWT Steering Committee to have some external influence on where we want to go. So one of the first decisions the steering committee made after starting it was that we'd switch from using Subversion and WriteVeld for source control and code reviews to using Git and Gerrit. And one of my first projects was kind of handling this. So October 2012, I set up an official Git mirror. I guess I should say, back when we were doing development internally, that meant GWT was hosted out of our internal Perforce server, and we would mirror changes out into Subversion. We set up this Git mirror, and that was based on the Subversion one. So we'd commit a change to Perforce, it would get mirrored to Subversion, then we'd get mirrored to Git. It was kind of a mess, but it worked. And we were able to start using Gerrit for code reviews. If you're familiar with Gerrit, it's kind of an integrated code review Git repository system where you're able to upload changes and submit them directly through the web interface. And so we weren't initially using it for the submission part, only for the code review. And earlier this year, we finally managed to switch over to using Git as now the source of truth. So instead of the complex mirroring system, we now authoritatively host GWT out of Git, and Google's GWT team is responsible for importing patches back internally. And so we were able to have our first commit to Git that month, and we've had a lot more since. Kind of the delays, I mean, there's a several month difference there, and that was mostly from trying to figure out how we do our new workflows, since at the time Google was the main contributor. We didn't want to slow down our internal developers, but we definitely wanted to make this transition because we think it's a long-term benefit. And we also had a lot of new members on the team, and since the existing system was already fairly complicated and we were moving to a new complicated system, training them on how to deal with that was fun. So the new Gerrit review process, it's still got some rough spots, but I think it's definitely improving a lot. So for example, I looked at the number of patches we've had submitted by external users. Last year, we had about 5% of all patches came from external users, and I think it was something like only 7 non-Googlers committed patches last year. Whereas this year, in the same period of time, we've seen about 20% of the patches come from externally, and that's across 22. So we've had a 4x improvement in patches and a 3x improvement in number of people. So now the Gerrit workflow is still a little awkward if you haven't used it before, especially if you're familiar with, say, GitHub or something where you kind of use Git and more just commit and keep adding more patches and then you do merges. In Gerrit, there's a lot more amending and rebasing, and people tend to get caught up on that a little bit at first, but we give them help and they figure it out. I think, and I suppose kind kind of the remaining rough spots that I've really seen are we don't have a sense of owners. So projects like Chromium, they've got very well-defined, these people are responsible for the UI, these people are responsible for the security libraries, and so on. And you're expected when you make a change to get an appropriate owner to review your code. We don't quite have that in GWT yet. We're a smaller team and we have a lot of code. And so we have sort of rough ideas of who owns what, but it's something we definitely want to improve. And we're definitely looking for more people to step up and kind of help maintain some of the parts of GWT where our team doesn't have expertise with it at the moment. And it would be nice to share that load. So, and then I guess the other thing is in Gerrit, at the moment, Gerrit has only recently Gerrit added a distinction between reviewers and who's CC'd on a change. And on Rightveld, we had this distinction where you could see who's the reviewer for a patch, and you're expected to get approval from those people. Other people are always able to add comments, but it kind of gives the developer an idea of who you need to satisfy or appease, and at what point you've got enough approvals to commit something. And like I said, Gerrit just recently kind of added this distinction. We'll see how it kind of plays out, but at the moment that's been, I think, a sore point as well. People upload patches, and sometimes it's not always clear if it's okay to commit yet. But these are things that are improving, and I'm hoping as we get more and more contributions, things will kind of fine-tune. So another thing, open source integration tests. So GWT has a very extensive set of unit tests. Kind of all of the different functionality has tests, and we always encourage people when they fix bugs to add more regression tests. But part of that is since it's so extensive, it takes a long time to run. Internally, we're able to run this, and we sharded over 1,000 build and test jobs, and it still takes about 10 minutes. So for the open source project, we run basically a partial test suite, and we don't do continuous integration like we do internally, but we do run that partial test suite 4 times a day, which tends to be pretty good. And we run a subset of the tests, but it still takes about 2.5 hours. So that's something I'm interested in improving too. It's a kind of resource constraint issue. So, like I said earlier, internally at Google, we care a lot about pre-submit checks. So we did want to get some pre-submit testing for the open source project. So right now, what we have set up is that whenever you upload a patch set, it goes through a minimal set of API style and build checks. And so these are things like making sure that the code builds. It's a little easier for us to recover if a couple tests are failing. We can figure out why, and we can work on a patch, or we can revert things if necessary. But when we first switched to using Git, we had people would upload patches that broke the GWT compiler entirely, and those are a bit harder to, when everything is failing at that point, you kind of have to just roll back. So now we at least we're able to make sure that everything's going to build, and we'll be able to run the tests later on. API checks, we care a lot about backwards compatibility, so we have a system that can check if you add a new method, or if you try to remove a method or change a method signature or anything like that, it'll give you warnings about this is going to cause problems for users upgrading from GWT 2.5 to 2.6 or something. So we want to make sure that whenever we make backwards incompatible changes that they're really explicit. And so this is one of the checks we're able to run as well. And kind of the last one that I at least like a lot is the style checks that I'm a fan of very consistent code. And one of the things we did recently was we sped up and improved the style feedback a lot. So now when you upload a patch, you're able to get feedback on style nits within just a minute. The system gives you inline comments about, oh, you're supposed to put spaces here or not put spaces there. And I think that's helped users a lot in noticing are fixing those issues before it would just end up in the build output and you have to go look at some complicated output. And so that's the status of where things are. It's usually works out pretty well. It could definitely be improved. This is all handled by a little project or program I wrote called Build Glue. It's also in the GWT open source project. It's a little Go program. If you've ever written Go or if you have any interest in it, it's maybe 200 lines of code, and it's pretty functional for what it does. But it could definitely be a lot smarter. So I'd love if people sent patches to make it smarter. So another thing, we've got a website, gwtproject.org. Originally, a lot of GWT documentation was on google.com, kind of spread out around places. And it was difficult for external people to contribute. It was also difficult for internal Googlers to contribute to. And now it's hosted out of the same code repository as anything else. So Googlers and non-Googlers can all very easily submit patches to it. And it's turned out to work out pretty well. We've had about 200 commits from about 25 authors, and most of them aren't from Google. And documentation is definitely, I think, something that's really important. And if you want a way to contribute to the GWT open source project, documentation is a great way to do that. Improvements, fixes, anything. So send us patches. I should add, there's a workshop tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I think Michael Vach on, I forget what's called. I'm sorry? Yeah. How to become a GWT committer. And he goes over the process of checking out the source code. Oh, back there with his hand raised. He'll be giving a workshop on how to actually check out GWT source code, how to build it, how to fix it, or add a test, and all the steps involved in contributing to GWT. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend going to that workshop. So that's kind of a, yes? So we have a Google Code issue tracker. It's still under the name Google Web Toolkit because of URL naming issues. But we accept bugs there and patches there. So that's kind of the best way to report bugs. So like I said, that's a status of where the GWT open source project is today. Kind of going for future directions, like Ray mentioned during his keynote, a big focus for GWT right now is making development easier. That we want developers who start using GWT to have a really easy time get started and get going. And I'd really like the same experience for contributors to the GWT project. We want it to be easy to check out the GWT source code, make changes, send us patches, and collaborate on GWT itself. I don't think we're there yet, but I'm really hopeful that we're able to improve in the future. So in general, we're trying to really reduce the complexity in GWT and eliminate a lot of the technical debt that we've accumulated over the years. So removing things like old deprecated APIs or old browser support that isn't necessary today, but it adds a lot of negative value to GWT internally by making things more complex and buggier. So one of the concrete things we have in mind is trying to revamp the build system. Right now, the open source build uses ant build files, and they work. They're able to put together the GWT releases, but they're not really great. We don't have incremental build or testing. If you make everything builds monolithically, and then everything tests monolithically. So if you make one small change, there's no easy way to know what tests are affected. You have to run all the tests every time. And like I said, that can take hours. So in practice, people tend to kind of skip doing that, which I don't think is great. There's also not really good IDE integration. We have support for Eclipse and IntelliJ, but we have to maintain them separately, and that's something we want to improve as well. And there's no dependency management. We're still all of GWT's third-party dependencies we just store in Subversion, and we manually update it. And we'd really like to kind of take advantage of more modern things like Maven Central. So we've had a lot of discussions about alternatives. Originally, we were planning on moving to Maven because we already support Maven for downstream users. But after working on it for a while, we've kind of decided that's not a good fit for GWT. We still plan on supporting downstream users using Maven, but internally or within GWT, our current focus is more on Gradle or Buck, and we're hoping to have something kind of Q1 next year where we would have an easier way of checking out GWT, building it, loading it into your IDE of choice. And so then I guess the other big issue in my mind is establishing a backwards compatibility policy. So other projects, for example, Guava has a very formalized policy where they guarantee backwards compatibility for 18 months. That if they remove an API, they'll mark it as deprecated, and they'll give you a timeline for when you need to move off of it, but they won't remove it before then. And I think that's really good for users, that users have predictability about how they can rely on APIs. And I'd really like to see something like that for GWT. Within Google, since we do operate entirely from head, no branching, we're able to kind of deal with backwards incompatible changes. It's a pain, and we don't like dealing with it, but it's something, it's not insurmountable for us. But we don't really have an idea of what that experience is like for external users. If we make a backwards incompatible change to some core functionality, and your code depends on that, and you also depend on a third-party library that maybe depends on it, we don't have a good sense of how external users are affected by those kinds of changes. So I think this is somewhere where we really need a lot of community input on this, on how to set up a reasonable compatibility policy so that we can still move forward and add new features, remove old deprecated functionality, but not leave our users in a state where they're stuck on old versions of GWT just because that's the only version that works with their libraries. So I think this is definitely something that I'd like feedback from people as well. And so that's about it for my talk. I think we'll probably just do merge Q&A at the end. Okay. So thank you, everybody.